We're just giving everybody an example of how confused an ancient Egyptian would be by technology if they existed today. So, thank you so much for your patience, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kelsey Winters. I work in the museum with Collen Cramer, who's our head of museum services, and he's providing our Carnegie lecture for this month. We're really excited to hear what he has to share about the influence of ancient Egypt on the Lord of the Rings and other fantasy literature. So we're going to let him get started. There will be time for questions at the end. So if you come up with any questions about ancient Egypt, Lord of the Rings, anything else that sounds interesting from what Collen is sharing, please feel free to just chime in at the end during that question time. Feel free during the lecture to get up and get more cookies and punch if you want. It's there for you. And then I'll give a reminder of this again at the end, but we have pulled a selection of books about today's lecture topic. So if what Collen is sharing sounds interesting to you and you want to learn more about any of the book titles that he shares, the works of the authors that he shares, or ancient Egypt itself, there are books back at the back table. You're welcome to grab any of those after the lecture is done, and just make sure you check them out at the circulation desk with your library card before you leave. But without further ado, we will let Collen get started for us. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Kelsey. So for preface before I give this lecture, this was originally developed for an RC conference. It's the American Center of Research in Egypt in St. Louis back last fall. So if there's any words, names, or anything that you don't know, feel free to ask me at the end of the lecture. I'll be happy to explain it. So J.R.R. Tolkien was one of the most prominent authors and academics of the 20th century. It is difficult to overstate the influence that he has had upon the genre of fantasy literature and upon Anglo-Saxon studies. Had he never written The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, he would still be a well-known name in academia for his work on the Beowulf epic, which revolutionized how scholars approach the study of Beowulf and other pieces of North European literature. However, Tolkien became a household name because of his fantasy novels. The fame of his legendarium has made Tolkien regarded as one of the founding figures of modern fantasy literature and has made him the elephant in the room for the genre. Almost all works of modern fantasy feel his influence either through inspiration or as reaction against him. Due to these reasons, the academic field of Tolkien studies took form in recent years, which critically studies his body of work, his influences, and the influences he has had upon others. The most well-known and frequently cited influence upon Tolkien is the mythologies and histories of North European cultures, in particular, the Norse Eddas and the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf. The evidence for Tolkien's North European influences can be seen from his work as professor of Anglo-Saxon, the drafts compiled by his son, Christopher Tolkien, and his own letters. The extent of this influence and Tolkien's openness about it has caused decades of discussion on the Eurocentricity of his Lord of the Rings. These discussions have led to a diverse range of opinions on Tolkien, his works, and upon the fantasy genre itself. What these forms of discourse leave out is the many non-European sources of inspiration that Tolkien drew upon for his legendarium. Aside from classical Mediterranean sources, the most prominent sources that Tolkien drew upon was from ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East. These influences from Egypt were used by Tolkien to create a sense of deep history in his stories. They conjured images of once mighty empires and grand monuments now lost to time in Middle-earth. More significantly, for the genre of fantasy literature, the inspirations that Tolkien drew from Egypt to create a sense of antiquity in his world has inspired further works of fantasy. When modern authors draw inspiration from Lord of the Rings to create a sense of antiquity in their own worlds, they are indirectly drawing from the real-world examples of Egypt and the Near East that Tolkien used in his writing. Before continuing on to Tolkien's relationship with Egyptology, however, it is worth quickly expanding upon the role of Egyptomania and Orientalism in 20th century Britain. Since the decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822, Egyptomania had swept across British and French popular culture. The popular fascination with ancient Egyptian culture in Britain was intrinsically tied with European Orientalist attitudes towards the Arab and Islamic world. Orientalism in post-colonial studies is the concept of Western patronizing views of the Middle East and Asia. The recognition and study of the concept was popularized by the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said in his book, Orientalism, published in 1978. Orientalism manifests itself in the practice of Western countries, such as America and Britain, essentializing, otherizing, and exotifying the cultures, histories, and societies of the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. The West essentializes these societies as static, undeveloped, creating a view that they may be studied, depicted, and reproduced in service of Western hegemony, which may be manifested through art, scholarship, and politics. Implicit in this is the view that Western cultures are developed, rational, flexible, and superior. The result is that, in the Western imagination, Eastern cultures are simultaneously an alluring exotic subject and a threat to Western civilization. Manifestations of this concept have persisted throughout Western involvement in depictions of the Middle East, from the colonial periods of the 19th and 20th centuries to the modern era with the US presence in Iraq and the global war on terror. In all these manifestations, the societies of the region, past and present, are viewed as an ethnic and religious other, both exotic and dangerous to Western civilization. Egypt's geographical and historical connection to Northeast Africa and Western Asia led much of Britain to apply the same essentializing and exotic attitudes towards the cultures of the Nile Valley, ancient and modern. Ancient Egypt's separation from Britain in space and time, coupled with its role in the Hebrew Bible and attribution by Greek authors as the center of science and philosophy, allowed British scholars and authors to morph views of Egypt into how they saw fit. The control of Western knowledge of ancient Egypt was aided in that fact following Napoleon's invasion in 1798. Egypt was controlled either militarily or economically by French and British powers. Egypt was militarily occupied by Britain from 1882 until the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. During all this time, control over ancient Egyptian antiquities and research was in the hands of the British and Indigenous Egyptians were actively prohibited from becoming Egyptologists until well into the 1900s. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the perception of Egypt and British culture was characterized by analogies between ancient Egypt and Imperial Britain. Many British thinkers saw Egypt as a direct precursor to the British Empire and Western civilization. Others saw ancient Egypt as a primary source of esoteric and occult knowledge, a belief that is still prevalent amongst many today. And that right there could be a whole lecture in itself. There is a lot of crazy cults and stuff about ancient Egypt. If any of you guys have watched Ancient Aliens on History Channel, you'll know what I'm talking about. Other ways that Egyptomania manifested itself in early 20th century Britain is through architecture, domestic wear, and adventure literature. Most important to the study, however, is the manifestation of Egyptomania in the genre of early fantasy and adventure novels. This form of media was one of the most explicit in its Orientalist depictions, while also being the most influential to future works of literature and media. The avenues by which Egyptomania made inroads into popular culture in Britain can be attributed to the popularity of the British Museum, the wave of interest coming from the excavations of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, and the many popular tracts of ancient Egypt authored by Flinders Petrie in the mid to late 1800s. These sources made ancient Egypt a common topic of art, literature, and discussion, especially among the middle class in Britain and intelligentsia. With this context in mind, we can more readily explore Tolkien's own relationship with Egyptology and popular Egyptomania. The earliest association with ancient Egypt that we know of in Tolkien's life was during his time as a teenager in King Edward's in the early 1910s. According to Tolkien's biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, Tolkien conversed extensively with his best friend, Christopher Wiseman, on languages. Tolkien was just now learning Old English and Gothic, while Wiseman was studying ancient Egyptian. It is very difficult to say whether this had any lasting effect on Tolkien's later views of Egypt, but it is indicative that he had a passing familiarity with ancient Egypt from his early years. Accompanied by this early brush with Egyptology, Tolkien also studied classics during his early years at Oxford before he shifted towards the study of Old English. The study of classics is tangential to ancient Egypt, but during this time, he would have been exposed to the writings of Herodotus and Diodorus, who wrote about it. There is little information on Tolkien's associations with archaeology and Egyptology until many years later. When he was a professor, in an interview with his daughter, Priscilla Tolkien, she made mention that her father was an avid subscriber of antiquity and was thrilled when he received the March 1940 issue which featured the Sutton Hoo excavations. It is unknown how long he was subscribed to antiquity, but even in the March 1940 issue, there was an entry in ancient Egypt that Tolkien would have been exposed to, a review on the 1938 excavation of the mastaba of Meroruca. It is reasonable to think that he would have had at least paid a cursory glance at other articles on the subject in the issues that he received. Roughly around the same time, in 1939, Tolkien gave his famous lecture on fairy stories, in which he made a literary and anthropological case to defend the merit of fantasy literature. Tolkien read widely to prepare for this lecture and referenced many different historical works of literature within the genre itself, or in the working notes for it. Within his working notes, Tolkien references Wallace Budge's An Egyptian Reading Book, and even more explicitly, Tolkien quotes from the Egyptian tale of two brothers in the lecture itself. He cites the tale as an example among many for the significance of the human heart in folkloric tales. From his references to the tale of two brothers, it is reasonable to think that Tolkien had some familiarity or knowledge of other pieces of Egyptian literature that were featured in Budge's reading book. And while it was not mentioned in his working notes on fairy stories, the Tolkien Library provides evidence that Tolkien owned a copy of Wallace Budge's translation of the Book of the Dead. It is very likely that this is also part of Tolkien's reading material when he was preparing for his lecture. Notably, in a letter from 1967, late in Tolkien's life, he stated, naturally, as one interested in antiquity and notably in the history of languages and writing, I knew and had read a good deal about Mesopotamia. While we unfortunately do not know what works on Mesopotamia that Tolkien had read, his interest in Mesopotamia reveals itself subtly in ways that will be touched upon later in this lecture. It is also a keynote that Tolkien was interested in antiquity in general. From the earlier evidence that we have of Tolkien's interest in Egypt, the statement suggests he may have also spent some time reading about the subject. A further indirect association with ancient Egypt that Tolkien had was in the adventure novels he read in his younger years. In a 1966 interview with Henry Resnick regarding his favorite books, Tolkien said, I suppose as a boy she interested me as much as anything, like the Greek shard of Ammonatus, which was the kind of machine by which everything got moving. Rider Haggard's She was a very influential adventure story published in the late 1800s, which would go on to inspire other works such as Indiana Jones. However, She, like much of Haggard's other works, was heavily inspired by ancient Egypt. Haggard himself was an Egyptophile, owning several artifacts from Egypt, such as a ring from Queen T, and he had made multiple trips to Egypt throughout his life. She itself is a very indirect association with Egypt that Tolkien had, but elements from the book She had a noticeable inspiration upon him, such as his book of Mazarbul and Lord of the Rings, showing a direct inspiration from the shard Ammonatus, which bore Egyptian hieroglyphs upon it. On the left, not necessarily on the screen, on the left-hand side is the book of Mazarbul that Tolkien created for the Lord of the Rings, and on the right is the shard of Ammonatus that's featured in the book She. With the context of Tolkien's real-world associations with ancient Egypt, we're able to look more closely at how these inspirations manifested themselves in his works. Within the Lord of the Rings, the evidence for Egyptian inspiration is most greatly seen in the cultures of Numenor and Gondor. This is explicitly said by Tolkien in a 1958 letter to Rona Bear, in which he stated that the Numenorians of Gondor were proud, peculiar, and archaic, and I think best pictured in, say, Egyptian terms. In many ways, they resembled Egyptians, the love of and power to construct the gigantic and massive, and in their great interest in ancestry and in tombs. I think the crown of Gondor, the South Kingdom, was very tall, like that of Egypt, but with the wings attached, not set straight back at an angle. The North Kingdom had only a diadem. Within this letter, he included an illustration of the crown of Gondor, which shows clear inspiration from the white crown of Upper Egypt. This letter shows that Tolkien knew more about ancient Egyptian culture than the average person, but it's impossible to tell whether he learned about the crowns from his own reading or from visits to the British Museum. Another possibility, rather than the British Museum, that may have informed Tolkien's inspiration for the crowns is the Ashmolean Museum. Tolkien often frequented a pub in Oxford called the Eagle and Child as a member of the Inklings. The Inklings was an informal literary club whose members discussed their writing projects and general narrative fiction with one another. Famous members apart from Tolkien were C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and Owen Barfield. Just across the street from the pub where the Tolkien and the Inklings met was Ashmolean Museum, which has an extensive ancient Egyptian and Near Eastern antiquities collection. We have no evidence that Tolkien and his fellows ever toured or frequented the museum, but based on his interests, it is very likely that he visited the museum at least once or maybe even multiple times. By following the letter's reference to Gondorian architecture, we can see other references to Egyptian culture. The most obvious example is the Argonath, which features in the Fellowship of the Ring. The text describes the Argonath as great pillars like towers rose to meet him. Giants they seem, vast gray figures, silent but threatening. Then he saw that they were indeed shaped and fashioned. The craft and power of old had wrought upon them, and still they preserved through the suns and rains of forgotten years the mighty likenesses in which they had been hewn. Upon great pedestals stood two great kings of stone. Still with blurred eyes and crannied brows they frowned upon the north. Great power and majesty they still wore, the silent wardens of a long-vanished kingdom. This description creates great similarity between the colossi of Memnon at the temple of Amenhotep III, which is pictured here, which is very likely the architecture that Tolkien was referring to in his letter to Rona-Bear. While it has much less description, the accompanying ruins of Amenhen near the Argonath that's featured at the end of Fellowship of the Ring subtly evoke the imagery of an Egyptian palace ruin. Another statue featured in the two towers bears similarities to another famous Egyptian monument as well. At the crossroads in chapter 7, Frodo encounters a headless statue of a king with no name. Its head lays a little away from the base. The scene strongly evokes the imagery made by Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, a poem that Tolkien would have certainly been familiar with. Shelley's poem reads, I met a traveler from an antique land who said two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that sculptor well whose passion red, which yet survives, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. This poem here is very similar to the text in the two towers that features what Frodo and Sam saw. There, far away beyond sad Gondor, now overwhelmed in shade, the sun was sinking, finding at last the hem of the great slow rolling pall of cloud and falling in an ominous fire towards the yet unsullied sea. The brief glow fell upon a huge sitting figure, still and solemn as the great stone kings of Argonath. The years had gnawed it, and violent hands hewed it. Its head was gone, and in its place was set in mockery a rough-hewn stone, rudely painted by savage hands in the likeness of a grinning face, with one large red eye in the midst of its forehead. Upon its knees and mighty chair, and all about the pedestal, were idle scrawls mixed with foul symbols. Suddenly caught by the level beams, Frodo saw the old king's head. It was lying rolled away by the roadside. Look, Sam, he cried, startled into speech. Look, the king has got a crown again. The eyes were hollow and the carven beard was broken. About the high stern forehead there was a coronal of silver and gold. A trailing plant with flowers like small white stars had bound itself across the brows, as if in reverence for the fallen king. They cannot conquer forever, said Frodo. Then suddenly the brief glimpse was gone. The sun dipped and vanished, and as if at the shuddering of a lamp, black night fell. Another example of this architecture featuring inspiration from ancient Egypt comes from the appendices of the Return of the King. In the section on the Annals of Kings, Tolkien writes, the great evil had come after, even the followers of Elendil remembered with pride the coming of the great host of Ar-Pharazôn out of the deeps of the sea. And on the highest hill of the headland, above the haven, they had set a great white pillar as a monument. It was crowned with a globe of crystal that took rays of the sun and of the moon and shone like a bright star that could be seen in the clear weather, even on the coasts of Gondor, far out upon the western sea. So it stood until after the second rising of Sauron, which now approached. Umbar fell under the domination of his servants, and a memorial of his humiliation was thrown down. From this passage, there are three architectural structures from the ancient world that Tolkien may have been drawing from, if not all three of them together. One of the stereotypical features of Egyptian architecture is the obelisk. These pillars were erected many times over the course of pharaonic history, detailing victories and religious epithets of their kings. Tolkien would have been very familiar with one specific Egyptian obelisk, Cleopatra's Needle, which was transported to London in the late 1800s and is featured on the left-hand side of the screen. Originally erected by Thutmose III and further inscribed by Ramses II, celebrating their victories in battle, the Cleopatra's Needle obelisk now resides in Westminster as one of London's most prized monuments. Another prominent monument that Tolkien may have been drawing upon is Trajan's Column. Erected by the Emperor Trajan in Rome, the triumphal column was created to commemorate Trajan's victory in the Dacian Wars in 113 AD. While it has less ties to Britain than the Westminster obelisk, the monument matches the description of Ar-Pharazôn's column more closely than Cleopatra's Needle in London. However, the most fitting match is actually Pompey's Pillar, erected in about 300 AD by the Roman Emperor Diocletian in Alexandria, Egypt. The triumphal column was erected by Diocletian to commemorate putting down a rebellion in Egypt. Pompey's Pillar more closely matches the description of Ar-Pharazôn's monument and was also more known to the British public than Trajan's column, being featured in many British Egyptian travel stories that Tolkien would have been familiar with. In addition to the monumental architecture of Gondor, the mortuary culture of the Númenóreans strongly evokes popular views of ancient Egypt. When referring to the culture of the Númenóreans, Tolkien's Silmarillion states, "They began to build great houses for their dead, while their wise men labored unceasingly to discover if they might the secret of recalling life, or at least of the prolonging of men's days. Yet they achieved only the arts of preserving incorrupt dead flesh of men. They filled all the land with silent tombs." This focus upon tombs and preserving the dead is still touched upon in the culture of Gondor in The Lord of the Rings. The character Faramir remarks, "Kings made tombs more splendid than houses of the living, and counted old names and the rolls of their descent dearer than the names of their sons." And most significantly, combining the monumental architecture and mortuary practices, the description of Numenor in Unfinished Tales evokes strong imagery of the Egyptian Valley of the Kings. Along the crest of the southwestern ridge, the climbing road approached the mountain, and between the ridge and that on the southeast, the land went down into a shallow valley. That was named Norinion, the Valley of the Tombs, for at its head chambers were cut in the rock at the base of the mountain, in which are the tombs of the kings and queens of Numenor. Other elements of Near Eastern influence appear subtly in the setting of Lord of the Rings as well. The Numenorian language, Adunaic, carries a slight Semitic flavor in its triconsonantal structure. Tolkien is reported to have said that it was based on Hebrew in an interview, but Tolkien scholar John Garth notes that in fact bears more greater resemblance to Akkadian. Sauron's Adunaic name, Ziggur, also bears resemblance to Ziggurat. Akkadian was the language that was featured common ancient Iraq, which is a little bit east of Egypt, for more context on that. Ziggur also bears resemblance to Ziggurat, which matches well with this construction of a Morgoth temple on Numenor, subtly evoking imagery of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, which is featured in this slide right here. Tolkien's references to ancient Egyptian imagery only begins to take shape in the 1930s. The reason for this stems from his distaste of the growing Volkish movement in Germany. His letters show increasing revulsion towards usage of North European imagery for nationalist and racial causes, going so far as to denounce the word Nordic for its association with such movements. Showing little evidence of an understanding of Orientalism, as mentioned earlier, however, Tolkien seems to have drawn from the ancient Near East as a source devoid of the imperialist connotations that North European sources had. The image of Egypt as also matched well with the idea of an island empire reminiscent of the Middle Earth Atlantis. It served as a ripe example of an ancient empire whose descendants only half remembered it in a land dotted with its ruins. Unfortunately, Tolkien does unintentionally fall into some Orientalist tropes. The associations and imagery of ancient Egypt are applied towards the Empire of Numenor, which was originally inspired by the British Empire. There are no associations with ancient Egypt with the cultures of Harad, which are associated with Africa and the Middle East. In doing this, Tolkien commits the old practice of disassociating elements of the other to make them part of the self. The lack of proper representation for the cultures of Harad and the East is something that Tolkien seems to have become self-aware of in his later writings, but he did not live long enough to expand much upon them. Other ways that Tolkien's writings evoke Orientalist and sometimes blatant racist tropes or on how he depicts the orcs in The Lord of the Rings. In an infamous letter, Tolkien describes orcs as squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. Mongol types in this context meaning Asians. Another passage from The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, describes the armies of Sauron and reads, Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul, had flung them into the fray. Easterlings with axes and Variags of Khand, Southrons and Scarlets, and out of far Herod, black men like half-trolls with white eyes and red tongues. This description, while intending to evoke the characteristics of a medieval epic, results in the same imagery that appeared in the colonial period that caricaturized sub-Saharan Africans. And lastly, while Tolkien himself denied any connection between the West versus East conflict in The Lord of the Rings with the modern world, it is worth noting that in the medieval and early modern period, the Christian Byzantine Empire and later the Austrian Empire were viewed by Europeans as a bulwark protecting Europe from the ravages of the Muslim Middle East. Paralleling this, it is noted that more than once in The Lord of the Rings that the Kingdom of Gondor is the bulwark protecting the Shire and the rest of Middle-earth from the ravages of Sauron's Mordor and Harad. Despite these and other elements of Lord of the Rings that may appear problematic to modern audiences, Tolkien was also an outspoken critic of racism and colonialism in his own time. In the years leading up to World War II, when asked if he had any Jewish ancestry by German publishers who were in the works of publishing a German translation of The Hobbit, Tolkien wrote a scathing letter to his English publicists denouncing Hitler and the Aryan movement that had taken hold in Germany. Later, in the 1940s, Tolkien wrote a letter to his son, who was stationed at the time in South Africa, denouncing the system of apartheid in the country, which oppressed the native Black Africans. Another letter denounces the entire colonial empire of Britain and America, reading, though in this case, as I know nothing about British or American imperialism in the Far East, it does not fill me with regret and disgust. I am afraid I am not even supported by a glimmer of patriotism in this remaining war. I would not subscribe to a penny to it, let alone a son were I a free man. It can only benefit America or Russia, probably the latter, but at least the Americo-Russian war won't break out for a year yet. This letter referring to near the end of World War II. These letters help provide a more complex view of Tolkien, who was a product of his own time. While significant elements of Tolkien's stories come from non-European sources, they are presented in a way filtered by Tolkien's own lived experience as a middle-class British academic in the mid-20th century, and in certain ways perpetuate Orientalist tropes. However, his usage of deep history as a major element in the Lord of the Rings setting became a great inspiration for later pieces of fantasy literature. And through Tolkien, these elements of Egyptian history have been a continual presence in fantasy literature. Following the publication of Lord of the Rings, several major names in fantasy literature actively drew upon Tolkien to make their own works. Some of them, such as Terry Pratchett, who was a very famous author in Britain. He's becoming more famous in America now since his death, but here is some passage that Terry Pratchett wrote about Tolkien. When I was young, I wrote a letter to J.R.R. Tolkien. Just as he was becoming extravagantly famous, I think the book that impressed me was Smith of Wootton Major. Mine must have been among hundreds or thousands of letters he received every week. I got a reply. It might have been dictated. For all I know, it might have been typed to a format, but it was signed. He must have had a sack full of letters from every commune and university in the world, written by people whose children are now grown up and trying to make a normal life while being named Galadriel or Moonchild. It wasn't as if I'd said a lot. There were no numbered questions. I just said I'd enjoyed the book very much. And he said, thank you. For a moment, it achieved the most basic and treasured of human communications. You're real, and therefore so am I. Terry Pratchett also said about Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either had made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or was in fact standing on Mount Fuji. Another author, George R.R. Martin, who created Game of Thrones, which recently became a very popular series on HBO, wrote this about Tolkien as he was himself trying to separate himself from the influence of Tolkien. Tolkien, of all authors I mentioned earlier, had an impact on me, but Tolkien is right up there at the top. I yield to no one in my admiration for the Lord of the Rings. I reread it every few years. It's one of the great books of the 20th century, but that doesn't mean that I think it's perfect. I keep wanting to argue with Professor Tolkien through the years about certain aspects of it. Throughout the Game of Thrones books, there are several elements I've mentioned earlier of the ancient history and setting that makes the Game of Thrones setting feel more alive. It's heavily based on, unlike Tolkien, who is basing things on late antiquity, late Rome, and Anglo-Saxon England, Game of Thrones is based more upon the War of the Roses in Britain in the late medieval period. But parts of his books, such as the area of Marine in Game of Thrones, heavily draws upon Egypt, which also comes from the elements in Lord of the Rings that George R. R. Martin was referring to. And finally, the biggest author of all this bunch is Ursula K. Le Guin. She was an American author who is probably, in literature circles, is regarded as one of the most highly praised authors ever in the 20th century. She wrote, "Critics and academics have been trying for 40 years to bury the greatest work of imaginative fiction in English. They ignore it, they condescend it, they stand in large groups with their backs to it, because they're afraid of it. They're afraid of dragons, they have smogophobia. Oh, those awful orcs they bleat, flocking after Edmund Wilson. They know if they acknowledge Tolkien, they'll have to admit that fantasy can be literature, that therefore they'll have to redefine what literature is. They're too damned lazy to do it." Ursula K. Le Guin later went on to win 2 Nebula Awards, 3 Hugos, and I think 20 Locus Awards. And her Left Hand of Darkness book, which is sci-fi, is regarded as one of the best sci-fi books ever written, next to Dune, if any of you guys are familiar with Dune. This just goes to show there's some examples of Tolkien's prevailing influence with 20th century fantasy and modern fantasy. I picture this slide here, especially The Priory of the Orange Tree and The Shadow of the Gods are 2 books that heavily draw upon Tolkien, and also The Great History of Middle-earth inside Tolkien's, which indirectly comes from ancient Egypt and ancient Rome. And I'll be off the lecture if any of you guys have any questions.
You got that stuff in your library?
We have some of them in the back here, actually.
No, I said, do you have it in your library?
I have some in my library, yes.
If people are interested in learning more about fantasy or reading outside of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, reading fantasy that was inspired by ancient Egypt, what would be your personal recommendation?
My personal recommendation would probably be Terry Pratchett's Lord of the Rings, but not I just had a brain fart. Terry Pratchett's Pyramids. Terry Pratchett, I mentioned earlier, who's a British author who did a lot of social commentary and kind of humor in his books, but his Pyramids draws directly from ancient Egypt. It takes place in a pseudo-Egyptian fantasy world. It's a really funny book. I recommend it to most people.
Were the inspirations and like Egypt culture and history, were they something that his readers would recognize at the time, or is it something that like recently you've been starting to pick up?
I think it's something that most readers didn't recognize at the time. I think because Tolkien was regarded as the professor of Old English and Anglo-Saxon literature in Oxford, most people focused on that bit of his inspirations, which was very prevalent. He was very strongly influenced by like Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas and everything. So the influences he had from ancient Rome and ancient Egypt tend to go under the radar a lot of times. Rona Bear, who I mentioned in the letter where he talked about the crowns of Gondor, seems to have been the only one to have wrote to him about the Egyptian influence.
Any further questions from anyone? Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Another round of applause. out to help yourself some more punching cookies, and then check out the table at the back. We were very generously donated a map of Middle Earth that's beautiful from a local Marion resident. If you want to have a visual reference for the world that Tolkien created. We also have Collen's business cards if you're interested in connecting with Collen or learning more about the topic. Some word searches because this week was International Museum Day, so we were celebrating with the museum thing word search you're welcome to take with you, and then the books that we mentioned